Good afternoon, students. Today we're going to be talking about Eros, who is a god, and also erotic magic, or magic that creates Eros. Eros, in this sense, is not like we would use it in the sense of the term erotic, which we would think of being sexy or fancifully sexy. Eros is an uncontrollable, miserable affliction that can be brought up, that is caused by gods, is caused by your own ridiculousness and being human, or is inflicted upon you by a sorcerer. All right, so let's get right into it. I have, sorry, I have a few observations I want to make about studying magic in general and the use of your imagination. So, what we're doing when we're studying magic and we're studying magic rituals, maybe when we study rituals in general, is we're actively engaging our imaginations. We look to the details at the rites, then we imagine the rites, and then we draw conclusions from the rites. Imagination is really the key here, and it's easy to imagine something sort of visually, to visualize it, to think of the visual imagination, but you also need to use your other senses. Imagine the sounds, the touch, the taste, the feel on your skin, the smells of the ritual. So in your brain, you should sort of map out the ritual space, like map out, like if it's a circle, draw the circle, like imagine where it is, by a tree, it's in the middle of nowhere, it's in an old church, wherever. So you imagine and map out that ritual space, the markings on the ground and whatever. Then I want you to imagine sort of the people, or just the operator. Is it the operator sorcerer doing the magic rite, or does he have clients there? Does he have other people that are involved in the rituals? Then imagine all of the ingredients sort of laid out before you and kind of visualize them. Imagine what they look like. Imagine what they smell like. Imagine what they look like. Then I want you to sort of imagine the sounds of mantras and liturgies and statements in the ritual. Sometimes these are called voces magicae, which refers to magical languages or magical language that can be pronounced. It is possible to be pronounced, but it is sort of semantically gibberish. It doesn't have a lot of meaning. Then you should sort of imagine the operator, or even imagine yourself as the operator, performing all of the actions that are prescribed for the ritual and imagine the touch, the taste, the smell, and the sound there. So then you imagine finally concluding the ritual. But in this point, really put yourself in the position of the ritualist. What do you feel after the ritual is over? Accomplishment, anxiety, exhaustion, shame? What do you feel? What would the operator feel as the ritual concludes? This last little bit about what do you feel at the end should also be extended to the psychological and emotional states for the operator throughout the rite. In this way, we're having empathy for the operators and the clients. We're empathically thinking. We're thinking about what their feelings would be like. Empathy is more than just putting yourself in someone's shoes, but it's trying to realize the inner states and the inner emotions of other people. So in this way, I would argue when we're reading these magic rituals and imagining them, we're doing a sort of historical fieldwork, almost a historical anthropology, but instead of going and hanging around with a group of people and studying them, our data is our reading and our imagination. So we generate a sort of thick description using imagination. Now, thick description is a concept by Clifford Geertz, who talked about it in 1973 in his classic article, Thick Description, Toward an Interpretive Theory of Culture. And thick description, an ethnographer, one who is studying cultures and ethnicities, if anything you want to use there in the widest sense of the term, the ethnographer is sort of becoming embedded in a culture and tries to understand it. Now, there are four aspects of a thick description. One, it is an interpretive study. What you're doing in thick description is it interprets the manner in which meaning is ascribed. So you don't just rawly describe everything that happens, but you're making some sense of interpretations and speculations and trying to note as much as you can about the situation as you're experiencing it. So imagine you are witnessing a cultural event and you're trying to make note of everything that happens. Now, the subject of an ethnography and its interpretation is the flow of social discourse. So as you're looking at what's going on, if you're looking at your data as it's happening, You're establishing and trying to unveil the sort of codes and the social codes that are required to understand these social events. You're trying to look at the fullest social context as possible. Also, your interpretation in a thick description should deal with extrovert expressions. What we mean by this is you're listening to what people say, to people who are telling you things. Your interpretation is based on data. You're describing the culture based on what is told to you by those within the culture who you're reporting upon. Finally, ethnographic description is microscopic, not macroscopic, microscopic. It uses local, context-specific interactions and phenomena. It does not generalize. So when you're thinking through these rituals, imagine you're a participant and try to figure out the social conditions there, the ways people are interacting, what's going on, why it's going on. So thinking through these rituals is almost like being a participant observer, which in ethnography means that the ethnographer is performing and acting in the culture while also recording the culture and her own experiences in the culture. So if I was a participant observer in a Catholic Mass, I would be standing, I would be sitting, I'd be looking to the priest, I'd be singing, I'd go up for communion. I'd do all of those things and try as a participant and an observer. So as a participant observer in your mind, you should imagine yourself as if you are the client of one of these sorcerers or you are the sorcerer yourself. Okay, to go a little bit further, there's an idea that I quite like in religious studies called prescriptive imagination. So in prescriptive imagination, authors imagine rites and rituals and they write them down without ever doing them. They're not recording rituals that they've actually done. They're engaging in prescriptive imagination. Their imagination allows them to work out the details of a ritual and write them down without actually doing them. They're imaginative. Now here, the imagined rite, here the author would imagine the rite and prescribes it. Also, when you're thinking about how an author might be using the prescriptive imagination, you'd have to think that when they're writing that ritual, they're still engaging all the principles and building blocks of other rites as they're making this imagined rite. And I mean, I would even argue, especially when you're reading like a lot of these neo-pagan books that come out right now, and I know a number of neo-pagan authors, and I often ask after they've written all these elaborate rituals, I'm like, have you done any of these? And they always say, oh yeah. And I don't get a sense that they've done a lot of them. So when you see a ritual written down, do not assume that the author has actually done them. Have some doubts as to whether the authors have actually done them, in fact. Okay, so to go even a little step further, especially in Tantra, the type of Hinduism I study, rituals are often visualized by the practitioners, and the rituals are internalized. So one later phase of Tantra says, instead of doing sort of aggressive magic rituals, you just visualize them. That way your body isn't made impure by touching like feces or corpses or wine or something like that. You can do it all internally. So in this way, imagination creates a space where you can observe the rituals and interpret the rituals by visualizing them yourself. Imagination is your greatest tool in studying magic and in studying rituals and in studying magic rituals. So just because you can't see someone observing a ritual doesn't mean you can't have some interpretations of it and you can't think it through using your imagination, but your imagination has to be pretty vivid. But with practice, you'll get there. What do? I sit around all day and I read rituals in funny languages and try to observe them in my own head. So here's some caveats in regard to rituals and the study of magic rituals. We can never really know the full details of any ritual that is observed because we're reading a report or we're reading a book that tells you how you should do a ritual. We don't have access to the rites themselves, just records of the rites. This would be different if we could go and find someone who is practicing these specific rituals and we could observe them. Now, also, these rituals and magic rituals in general are non-canonical. So they're not in the canon. When I say canon, I don't mean what we say like, that's not canon as in like that can't happen in a Marvel movie because it doesn't correspond to the other movie or another book. Canonical means it is put in the canon, in the corpus, in the group of legitimized, authorized, and endorsed books by the church. So magic rituals are not canonical. They are they're often innovative. Sometimes they're descriptive, sometimes they're innovative with a prescriptive imagination. We cannot find some sort of pure version of this ritual that they all come out of. We can only compare different instances and innovations to other instances and innovations. We'll never find the essentially true first magic ritual. So what can we learn from studying texts like, say, ancient Greek love magic? Well, one of I think the most interesting things about studying rituals is you look at the material culture. What do I mean by material culture? I mean, like, what are the materials around? So if there's a whole lot of writing going on, they got pens and papers. If there's a whole lot of sacrifice of turkeys, there's a lot of turkeys. So, if they're using certain herbs that are said to be relatively easy to get, that tells you about that material culture. If they're using specific types of implements, it tells you more about the types of implements that are made in that culture, tools and whatnot. So also, when you look at the operator and the victim, you see social structures. So when you try to figure out, looking at the ritual, what social position is the operator and the victim? Are they male? Are they female? Are they dominant in society or lesser in society? So we kind of reverse engineer from our rituals to try to make some guesses on that. The use of gods and god hierarchies are revealed in rituals. We find out that some gods who are relatively minor might end up being really common in rituals. So they have a different aspect. You often do not see like the highest of the high gods. You wouldn't see Zeus, for instance, being invoked in an Eros ritual, but you sure see Eros. So you see a different reflection of the importance of the gods in daily life and their hierarchy outside of the mythological structure. Also, when you're looking at language, ritual texts are usually using a pretty basic, simplistic language, which is close to the daily life of your average Grecian, as opposed to something in like high literary culture. When it comes to language, also, if you see that there are foreign words that are borrowed into the magic rituals, it shows you there's context with another ritual. Now, overall, the studying of ritual is kind of a humanistic project, and ancient Greek love magic by Pharaoh is very much that. It's a study of man and humans trying to alter the world. The fun thing about magic is you have this vast archive. So when you read about magic and magic rituals, you can read widely and be amazed at the depth and primary and secondary sources. One of the things that I like to really enjoy in a book like this by Pharaoh is the sort of magic mystery tour of the footnotes. So I don't know if you're reading the footnotes carefully, but Pharaoh really has great footnotes, and they have some really interesting points throughout. And you can see that even when you have a big footnote like that, it shows you the confirmation that the conversation is vaster than just sort of the one sentence the person has brought. You get to see how they're referring to like 15 different people who have argued different things over time to get to the point where the author can make his intervention. Also, there are little jokes in footnotes often. A number of things can be found in that. Read the footnotes. They're kind of cool. We get new lights on literature. By studying magic rituals outside of literature, we can go into the ritual or we can go into the literature and see how the rituals are used, and that tells us even more about the literature. And then ultimately, what does Pharaoh come up with under ancient Greek love magic is to study gender and sexuality in practice as it comes about in rituals. All right, so on to the specifics. So we're here to Christopher Pharaoh, page 41 to 95. What is Eros? Well, Eros is a god. Eros is also, and the state of being afflicted by Eros is described like a disease. In fact, I was noticing that, and Pharaoh makes a good point of this, that a person being struck by Eros is described as if he was being killed in battle. So they say the same line, the mists cover the eyes. The mists of darkness cover their eyes as a way of saying that someone was killed in the Iliad. But here it would say like, oh, an Eros afflicted him or her, and the mists of darkness fell over her eyes. Her personhood, his personhood and agency are gone. Okay, so Eros, in fact, is described often one-on-one like a disease and as a disease in magical literature. Now, Eros as a disease can be granted by a god, by the god Eros, or by another god inflicting you with Eros. Or, in fact, it can be brought upon by nasty sorcerers that want to make you go crazy. How just nasty are they? Well, let's get into that in just a minute. So when we think about Eros, he's depicted as either having a whip or a bow and an arrow or a torch. Like he is violent. He makes things burn. He strikes with arrows. This is a similar figure to Kama, the god of desire in India, who rides a parrot and has a bow and arrow. But the arrows at the ends of their tips, where the arrowheads would be, are actually flowers. Being afflicted by Kama is very similar to being afflicted by Eros. So there is some connection there, though I won't posit an Indo-European connection. Anyway, so this diseases of this affliction from Eros can be God-given. And in fact, this God that gives it is the root of our Cupid, like we think of in the West today. So the disease of Eros can be brought upon by either the will of gods or by rituals. So like a curse, he writes on 49, if erotic passion is an accursed state, it stands to reason that techniques of cursing can be used to instill such a passion in another person. In fact, erotic magic uses the same language as violent curses to afflict enemies. May he be dragged by his guts. May he be pierced throughout all of his body. All of this sort of stuff. Like I would pronounce a curse onto someone. It's the same type of language that are used in the erotic affliction. And remember, erotic affliction is agitation, inability to be satiated, can't eat, can't drink, and then agoge, it leads, and then you're dragged as if by your guts to the sorcerer or the operator. And then you will be unable to resist having constant amorous actions with that operator. So Eros is like, imagine you are the most unrequitedly lovesick that you've ever been. That's a good indication of what they're starting to talk about with Eros. But an Eros affliction is thought to be completely devastating. I've been in love. It can be devastating. So Faroni starts out talking about Eros by describing this pierced figure, and I have a picture of the figure here. This is a common picture. Even as I look over here, there's this wonderful book called Magica Hiera. So that's Greek magic. It's on ancient Greek magic and religion, and it has a very, very similar item on the cover. It's a great book, by the way. Good collection of essays. So what's going on with these piercing effigies? Well, he notes that these are later than we would see in ancient Greek love magic, as we're looking at. But what we're looking at here is we're looking at a female effigy. Now, by effigy, I mean an image. An effigy that is pierced and bound. She is bound by her in her arms and legs, and she's pierced in all sorts of miserable ways. If we read one of the descriptions, she is thought to be pierced from all of her orifices, up top and down low. All right, so this is actually, when we're looking at this image, you would instantly think it's kind of like a voodoo doll. This is a death image. It's a curse to kill someone. But in fact, when we did a little bit more research, what we see is this is an Eros spell, and it's an agoge spell. So the Eros spell is to bring a specific woman to a specific man. Why the piercing, the violent piercing? Because the Eros is, and the feeling of Eros is supposed to be piercing and horrible. So it not only binds, so it keeps you from being able to eat or see or do anything. It afflicts, it binds and afflicts, and it gives an uncontrollable, miserable passion. So when the piercing occurs, and I think this is a general term that you can say for magic in general. Piercing is a performative ritual. It does something. It pierces the woman like Eros should pierce her. It inflicts pain like the piercing would inflict, like stabbing someone, but that pain is emotional pain. This is called, and we'll come back to this term, a persuasive analogy, in that I take the figure, I stick it with pins. The pins are supposed to be erotic desire, and then the actual person is afflicted with those erotic desires, just like the pins. Okay, now this is not a violent or disturbed individual who does this. And this is sort of interesting. It's not just that you're trying to cause a woman pain. In fact, causing a woman pain when we really get right down to it, isn't the result at all. That's not the desired result at all. The desire is to bring a woman to one and hopefully theoretically, to cement a marriage situation. So what we're looking at here is we're not looking at a depraved individual aiming to cut a woman up by cutting up her effigy, but we are looking at a culturally conditioned ritual action in which piercing of effigies is thought to bring about a piercing of erotic desire near toward madness. Now, when you think about the difference between Eros as a torture or a ritual that kills someone, you'll notice that Eros makes a woman miserable until they yield to sex. A killing ritual would just pierce and pierce and pierce until they die. So there are similar curses that he notes. One is that, and Pharaoh is talking about vows, almost like cursing vows. So Achilles in the Iliad says that he will not eat and drink until he has avenged Patroclus, his beloved, who was killed by Hector. Also, we have in the Christian New Testament, the enemies of the Apostle Paul vow to neither eat nor drink until Paul was killed. In the same way, when we read the languages of these erotic spells, a woman can neither eat nor drink until she comes forth to him. So she's deprived of sustenance until she yields unto sexual congress in one way or another. Okay, the next things I want to talk about is the Iunx or Iunx and Agoge. Iunx is like a name for a bird. I've thought about it quite a bit, not come to any great conclusions about it. I'd need a classicist to tell me more about this specific type of bird. And then the Iunx is an Agoge spell. An Agoge spell is a spell that leads, that brings the victim to the operator. We'll see this similarly in Sanskrit, where we see this word akarshana. Akarshana is a ritual that draws someone forward to you, whether it be an enemy so you can kill them, or a woman so you can sleep with her, or whatever. It draws and bewitches. We'll get into that when we do Indic stuff. So Iunx is a type of spell that uses persuasive analogies of frantic, maddening desires and emotions. The result is an Agoge spell, a spell that leads, that pulls the victim toward the operator. Now, this book has a glossary. I pulled this definition from page 176. Use the glossary. There's a lot of Greek. You're not going to be able to remember all the Greek terms. Pharaoh is pretty good about translating most things, but sometimes you'll want to look stuff up in the glossary. So Iunx is a salacious bird. So the Iunx is the spell itself, a lascivious, chirpy, weird, flighty, sexy bird. So a salacious bird and a type of Agoge spell that involves a sympathetic or persuasive ritual in which this bird, this very flighty bird, is tied to a wheel. Also, generally, an Iunx can be called an erotic spell. Use the glossary for these Greek words. Okay, so Pharaoh describes the ritual on page 58. A man binds a small lascivious bird on a wheel. Okay, so remember, the bird symbolizes lasciviousness. You might as well call it a horny bird. He got a small horny bird and he puts it on a wheel. Now, a wheel is a common implement for torture in the Greek world. So you'd take a big wheel, you'd tie somebody to it, leave them there, whatever, for torture. So we do have a notion of suffering on the wheel. A man binds a small horny bird on a wheel, and then he tortures it with whips and fire in hope that he can force his female victim from her family by transferring to her body, by means of persuasive analogy, the bird's natural lubricity and madness, lubricity also horny, as well as the additional pain and burning brought by torture. So there's two steps here. One, the qualities of the kinky bird go on to the victim, but also the torture of the kinky bird, those actions ought to be an analog to the experiences that the victim has of spinning, erotic, crazy desire. So it's a two-step process there. So it generates insanity and furious passions, like the bird, the horny, crazy bird. It transfers the abuse that is visited upon the bird onto the victim. But a third thing I want to note is it was common to sacrifice animals at the time, either to celebrate or to honor vows, or used in medicine or in magic. So if you're cringing at the harming of animals, Remember, it was not a cringy thing for these folk. You can feel cringy. That's okay. I feel upset when he talks about the sacrifice of the puppy. That bothers me. But the reality of it is, this is not our culture. So our judgments that animal sacrifice is wrong, that's to be bracketed and to be understood as kind of, to just say, our shit. That's our shit. Okay. So here's another one. This is just so great. Apples and stone fruits. So there's a manipulation of brides and brides-to-be by making them catch an apple or a stone fruit. Also a what do we call it? Also a thing called a melon. And then there's also what do you call it? Stone fruits, so like a peach or apples or pomegranates. Okay, so what happens is we have all these artistic depictions of these fruits being given between people who are courting or whatnot. And traditionally, classicists have thought these are love offerings. These are charms and tokens of affection. But this is actually a magic ritual. The stone fruits, or the apple, all having seeds, pomegranate has a ton of seeds, are seeded to show fecundity, fertility. All right, so these are rituals. Now, if you throw the enchanted apple to the woman and she catches it, she can either eat it or she can hold it close to her. Both will be effective in causing her to become erotically inclined toward the one who threw the apple. At one point, I have walked into class when teaching this section and thrown apples to students, and then I felt weird. And that was more fun to watch them throw apples at one another and us all have a big old laugh about the whole thing. So some of the sources actually suggest there's some consent here. Now, in the Eros, these erotic and agoge rituals with the yonks, there's no consent here. The woman is not consenting to be afflicted. But here there's a sense that she might just not catch it, or she might choose not to use it, or it's an elaborate social custom that kind of signals to the world that something's going on. Some sources note this consent and note that a lot of this fruit throwing is very public, so it's witnessed by other people. So a woman might feign her displeasure just in general, out of that being the custom. Once again, agoge spells and Eros inflicting spells and drawing towards spells, they have no element of consent. There is a folk tradition of eating aphrodisiac fruits, usually apples and quinces and whatnot. So of eating aphrodisiac fruits in an arranged marriage. In a marriage rites, sometimes a fruit is given to the bride. And Farone suggests that in an arranged marriage, the wife would eat this fruit that was thought to instill sexual desire to sort of build the connection with the husband and to kind of work out symbolically the fact that they're initiating a sexual relationship. There was also a fear around Greece that prostitutes would give someone enchanted fruit and then their clients would be destroyed by erotic love for the prostitute. We'll get into these social issues with sex workers in a little bit. What about fruits with seeds like pomegranates? You remember the story of Persephone? So Persephone is a goddess, well, the daughter of a main goddess, and she goes to Hades. And she's hanging out in Hades, in the underworld, with the Lord Hades. And she lives there for, I think it's 5 months. And while she's there, she eats 5 pomegranate seeds. So when she gets out, Hades says, all right, you can go back to your mama. However, for 5 months out of every year, you are going, in fact, to be in the underworld. Now, you'd think winter, right? But it's Mediterranean. It's the Mediterranean world. So the growing season is over the winter, and the summertime is actually the time when it gets just dry and desiccated and hot and burnt out. So imagine that Persephone, having left, has like, if you ever lived in Southern California, this is what it looks like. During the brown months, that's when Persephone is gone. And then when she comes back, she paints the flowers and they have spring and whatnot. There you go. Okay, so what are the social implications of all of this? And this is why we're getting into all of this. One, bridal theft was a thing. Now, bridal theft would be a somewhat arranged marriage in which the bride would be violently kidnapped and taken away from her familial home. We find this in India also called a rakshasa, or a demonic marriage. So if the woman was being forcibly seized, family members could easily get killed. So another thing could be that these Eros spells are described as a reason for a wedding. Maybe somebody got pregnant and they're trying to save face. So there are lots of social implications that could be said for why you could use erotic magic as an excuse to justify something. So the erotic magic that Ferrone suggests, and I think he's right on this, was predominantly not done by, dreadful incels wanting to get their girlies. It was used in the context of marriage and marriage jockeying, not just love frustrated folks, but those who are trying to manipulate marriages. Many of these horrific sounding spells actually function positively. They build social solidarity. They create and enhance interpersonal relationships. So the woman who's afflicted with terrible desire and leaves her husband's house, goes to her new husband, or leaves her father's house to go to her new husband. She can justify going there by the erotic state, by the Eros state of illness. And then once she gets there, that can be used as yet another level of tempting fate and making a social connection. So these are, as Ferrone describes them, these are dispassionate spells. They sound really horrible, but they're not done out of a frustrated desire. They're not done by a frustrated madman on the roof. They're done by somebody who wants to get a woman and get that woman to marry her eventually. So love magic is in fact declared to be part of a process that leads to a happy marriage. I mean, the big problem is, why would a man want to torture a woman of his dreams? Why would a man think of his beloved and want her to be completely afflicted by Eros? He does this to get her to him, and then the pain stops. So it's not a desire to torture. The operator, in fact, may wish to gain a woman beyond his reach socially and mentally, or monetarily. Eros rituals could also be a way for the socially mobile to move up. And by getting, a woman who is greater than his station, he might claim impressive dowries, the bride gift from the bride's family. Also, these spells are thought to subvert the erotic ownership of another man. So it's almost like it's not even done to afflict the victim. It's done to affect a weakening and a subverting of the victim's relationship with another man, namely her father, for whom she is property. We actually read poems valorizing the wisdom and the bravery of the ones who use the magic to seduce the daughter of other men and the daughters of other men. They're not vilified. They're not made to be thought horribly. They're like, smart guy using the goge right to make that marriage happen. So we could argue that all of these rituals are used by passionate, unrequited suitors. But the archive, the data themselves, makes clear that these spells make a woman eager to make love. And that increases the self-confidence of the operator. It has an effect on the operator in the sense that he has a feeling that he's going to be more confident in his amorous advances toward his target victim beloved. The agoge rite actually forces her away from a parent and pulls her toward her suitor. And that violence and that horrible erotic feeling will end, and ultimately a new social relationship between man and wife and between two families and clans will be established. So all these Greek stories about Eros magic resolve in a pretty happy ending and a happy marriage. The effects of magic are only temporary. So you have two steps again in agoge: affliction and drawing the victim to you, and then also establishing a happy relationship. In this way, there is a love and a hate at the same time. And I don't know if you've ever been in a long-term relationship, but there is an element of love and hate that come in, an element of competition, an element of agonism that can exist in long-term relationships. I had a friend who would always say, like, Aaron, you don't understand. Going to marriage is like going to war, and the war never ends. And he actually meant that in a pretty positive way, in fact. I won't go into it that much. But what I want to put at here is we can see the relationships between men and women, gender differences, marriage stuff, courting stuff. All of that can be found just by looking at these rituals. Now, a lot of our notions on gender in magic are going to be very highly subverted in the last chapter of Pharaoh, and I look forward to getting to that. But until then, we'll look at another magic next time called Philia, and that's a horse of a different color. All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye now.